that is included in the lineage of Jesus Christ. In Judah's firstborn of the twins, that Perez was a part of the lineage of bringing the blessing of Abraham, of the promise of the Messiah, came through that. And so it just points us to the fact that God chooses to use men as he chooses. Not as we see it, not as it looks right to us, but God chooses who he chooses based on his foreknowledge and his will in wanting to accomplish things. He uses catastrophe, he uses distress in our lives to exalt himself. The historical background, just I thought it was interesting, a couple of the things that were mentioned there, the relation that as man continues to study the history, the fact that in the historical information from the times of Egypt and how they are in the Bible, how so much they correlate. Talks about the time that Joseph was in Egypt, and the fact of slaves being there, the amount of price was paid during the period when Joseph was alive. It was determined that was the average price for slaves to be paid. They talked about having stewards that would take care of the houses of the rich people, and just numerous things that correlate with what Joseph received while he was there in Egypt. And so I thought it was just interesting, and I find it interesting when you continue as men continue to study historical facts in the world around, how that they relate so closely to what is in the Bible narrative, that God used the historical facts not to back up his word, but to reaffirm what his word says. And I trust that that's the way we see it, that the historical facts do not point us to the Bible, but the Bible points us to historical facts to solidify that what God says in his word really is true as man records history. And it'll be interesting if God tarries in another 100 years, what people will be able to see from the pages of Scripture, how that life is today according to historical facts. What is going to be recorded in history that people will be able to look back in the Word and say, that's why that happened in the life of Sam, in the life of Bob, the life of each one of us. They will be able, the historical facts, be able to point others to Jesus Christ, and as people read the Word, will they be able to look back and say, that's why they did what they did. And so, as we talked a little bit about last week, it ended with Joseph being sold by his brothers, envious and jealousy and special treatment. And I'd just like to stop there just for a moment. So do we treat any of our children special? Is there a favorite in your family? Is there someone that you would sooner be with? Well, we find over and over in the Scriptures that God tells us not to. But as humans, sometimes we do. And that can set us up can set our children up for issues and problems when we leave. And I hope that we're thinking about that, those of us that are here. Turn the mic up. Okay, that better? And we take seriously how we prepare the next generation to get along. You have emotional makeup, you have physical makeup, and you have spiritual makeup within each of our children, and the importance of having them prepared for when we are gone, are we doing what we can to make sure that there's not issues? You know, you look at Abraham had Isaac, and then he had other children. He separated them, and we have the result of that continuing on. We have you have Isaac having Esau and Jacob, and we have that fight that continues to go on today. It started way back and goes on today. And you have Jacob with his 12 children, and he chose Joseph, and we're studying about how that does. And sometimes God uses those things to bring about reconciliation, which I believe we'll study later on in the life of Jacob, how that he, in the life of Joseph, how that he was able to bring restoration. And so that gives us, the Bible gives us a caution about having favorites within our family, to treat them with love and acceptance for who they are. We treat each of them the way God has gifted them, the way God has called them to. And we did study, Derek studied a little bit about names and the character that so often when you choose a name for your children, it so often matches the character of that child. When you didn't really know, God directed you to the mind that you could look at that. And you studied the names of that you wanted your children, what it meant to you as you named your children. And I think that's very important, that we keep that concept open, that the name should be able to carry on the character of that child. And so at the end of chapter 37, it makes fact, verse 39, I want to turn chapter 37, verse 36, and the Midianites sold him into Egypt, into Pharaoh, into Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh's and a captain of the guard. And so that's where we ended, that Joseph was sold into the hand of Potiphar. And so, and then it says, and it came to pass, in chapter 38, and then 39, it says, and it came to pass again, and then 40, it says, and it came to pass. And so it doesn't give us time, but it gives us an idea that time was moving on, and there was there. And so today we want to look at Joseph's time in Egypt, and to understand how God related to Joseph while he was in a foreign land. And so we understand who Potiphar was. He was an Egyptian high-ranking officer, a captain of the guard. And so that's who we're studying about. This is one of the main characters that's in the Bible alongside of Joseph. So before we go on, are there any thoughts that anybody had in your study as you read through this, and any thoughts before we go on?
I just wonder how many other times Potiphar's wife tried to do what she did to Joseph, only an age before.
Mm-hmm.
So it shows what she was really made of, being faithful.
I want to thank you, Sam. I appreciate that. And I want to circle back around to that, and we'll go through part of this and then come back around to that. That's a very important fact, and it's a really important reminder for us today.
Is there an estimation of how long Joseph would have been in Egypt before Jacob came? How long was he there?
How long Joseph was in Egypt before Jacob came down? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, how long he was, he lived his whole life there after this. Well, how old was he when he was sold into slavery? And how long was he till Jacob?
Anyone have an answer?
Their timeline or estimation? I was just curious. At one point, I forgot. I don't think, but I don't think it's really hard for it. Should be able to figure out how old Jacob was when he died. So how long was Jacob missing his son?
Only around 16 or so, probably. When he was sold. And next week he's going to be 30. I think it is. I think that's the way it is, Bob.
I think that's right. I did not, I never, the timeline that they have, the AIG has, I think it has it on there, but I was thinking, he's 16 or 17 when he was sold, and he would have been, when Jacob came down, would have been close to 40, somewhere in that neighborhood, if I remember right. So almost half of his life, he was gone. So Jacob reunites with him. So I think that'll come out in when Jacob comes down. I think that comes out. I didn't read a whole lot further ahead, but so.
Back in lesson 45, it said Joseph was 17, probably,
Okay.
when he was sold. At least that's what I've written from somewhere.
That's an interesting fact. So, and I want to circle back around to that when we get into the fleeing temptation. I'll try and remember to bring that thought back to me if I forget. So, I want to look at, I talked about a couple of the things as I was reading. Did Joseph, let me think how I want to word this. Was Potiphar blessed because of Joseph doing a good job? Or what does our narrative say?
I think God was maybe looking out for Joseph no matter whatever situation he's in.
Yeah. But my question is it because of what Joseph did? Was it Joseph's initiative himself that the people were blessed, right?
Well, it was that God was with him, the Lord was with him. That phrase.
The phrase says this: the Lord was with Joseph, and he was a prosperous man. And it said the Lord made all that he did to prosper in his hand. It's referred to that it was the Lord doing the work through Joseph. Joseph did not do this on his own, but the Lord prospered. It's a capital L, which talks about the Elohim, about the God that, or the God Yahweh would have been, that he would have been him that led that. And Joseph had a relationship with God that I believe was established by Jacob, his father, as he was maybe a special son. He spent more time with him. He was an older man. He would have had more time. His sons were taking care of the animals, and he would have had more time to spend with Joseph. I don't know. It just tends to reason to me for that way. And so God blessed everything that Jacob did in a plan that Jacob would be lifted up and would be exalted. And so we find that in all of this here, God is the back writer. He is the one that's writing the story through the people. And so Potiphar, it refers to him as being the captain of the guard of the Egyptian. And so we find that this man was he would have been possibly chief of the armed forces, or chief of, he was very high ranking, lived in a rather luxurious house. And as we studied through it, it was made mention of the fact that the prison, in chapter 40, it talks about the prison that was in his master's house. And so it gives the sense that this captain of the guard was in charge of the prison, of the prisoners that were here. Maybe not of the prison, he had other people underneath him. We'll look a little bit at that. That the keeper of the prison and also the captain of the guard, the prison would have been possibly right next to his house so he could watch over. So Joseph went from the one side of the house with luxury in serving Potiphar to going to the prison which he was still over, in essence, as we see that. And so we find that while Joseph is there, it says is a couple interesting things. It says that he was a handsome man. He was godly and well favored. And so how long he served Potiphar, from the time he was 17 till he was bought, until God slowly worked in him. I don't think it happened immediately. I think it was a little over a period of time that Joseph continued to be faithful, continued to serve in integrity and honesty. And as Potiphar seen this, he continued to elevate him and continued to elevate him till finally there wasn't anything that Joseph did not know or do. It says Potiphar didn't even know, except for the bread that he was given, what was happening. Not only in the house, but it also says in the field. So Joseph understood a little bit about agriculture. Maybe he studied and understood how to make agriculture work. So everything that Joseph touched, God blessed. Not so much because of who Joseph was, but because of who God was. And that's the important thing we have to get out of this lesson, of what God is doing. And so he comes down here, and this master's wife, Potiphar's wife, she looks at him and thinks, oh, what a handsome young man, and lusts after him and longs for him, and started inviting him. You could draw a picture dressing more and more provocative, and finally the last day when she grabs a hold of him, burning with sensual desire for this young man, that she wanted him. And I think Sam mentioned the fact that, did she do this with other men? I don't know. But when you look at that character, it wouldn't surprise you. And so as we look at this, it talks about having a burning lust and desiring to have him. And he refused. The strong statement that he used was what?
How can I do this great wickedness? Is that?
Yes. How can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? He didn't say anything about sinning. Well, he referred her back to something that was outside of her, saying that, I can't sin. I'm not only sinning against you. He didn't really specifically say that, but he said, I can't sin against God, which is greater than our sin, greater than our lust, greater than our desire, and who we have to answer. And this is what he responded to her. And then it says, I don't know, I wonder if Joseph ever had a response back to her. It says she bugged him every day, looked for an opportunity. And Joseph, I believe, tried every opportunity not to be in her presence. And so he would not violate his master. So what was going on in the heart of Joseph? A young man with passions, the same. He was able to control them, and gives us the encouragement that we need to be able, as the Apostle Paul talks about, we need to be able to control our passion and our bodies in the way that God wants us to. And so we find that in the end of this chapter, that Joseph is framed by the wife, and Potiphar comes home. He's angry. He trusted Joseph completely, and now he finds, according to his wife, the accusation. And it just wonders me if Potiphar was thinking in his mind, I just don't know. Wonder if he understood his wife. Wonder if he understood all this. Joseph, he did everything, and everything was blessed, and now he's done this. He was angry. His initial result was he was angry. And so it kind of I'm kind of insinuating here a little bit, or assuming a little bit, that Potiphar's wife was probably a pretty good-looking woman. He had the opportunity to choose who he wanted. And so he would have chose her, and so one of his mind ever went to the fact that, if he was a chief of state and he was out gone, did his mind ever wonder, is my wife true to me? But he trusted Joseph. And that's the only one that, and it just wonders me, and it says he put him into the prison, which is, in the prison there, where the king's prisoners are bound, and that gives us the sense later on that this would have happened, that these people were given there. He had the opportunity to put Joseph in that prison.
Was Potiphar angry at Joseph or at his wife?
What does the narrative say?
Just says his anger was kindled in verse 19.
Mm-hmm.
That lesson points out in the reading, which I told about earlier, if Potiphar really believed or he'd have had him executed, the reason he was living in prison suggests he may have doubted the accusation. I don't know it for sure.
Well, that's interesting, because they do put a little bit of that in here, in the historical fact. A lot of times prisoners were executed. Egypt did have a prison house that a lot of other countries did not have. In that era, they just executed a lot of people. But yeah, I appreciate that, and I had that thought also, and I don't know if it was in here or not.
It wasn't our reading.
You say it was?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So that is very possible that could have happened. He could have executed his wife. He had the power to be able to do that if he didn't believe. So was he given the opportunity for both his wife to confess and Joseph to confess, and he put Joseph in prison, and Joseph proved that he was an honest man of integrity and believed in him. And we'll find out later on that eventually Potiphar would serve under Joseph when Joseph is lifted up by Pharaoh. She accused him that he was a Hebrew, a slur, a put down. This guy is a Hebrew. She used that.
And kind of throwing it back on Potiphar that thou bought,
Yeah.
going into his house.
It's interesting that this is before the era of the Ten Commandments, yet even the Egyptians had what they go off of. It was still integrity, it was still honesty, it was still some form of, without even having the Ten Commandments here.
Mm-hmm.
And both the Egyptians and the Hebrews, they had some form of that, whether it was written down or just that it was supposed to creation, that they had just a sort of an honor system or a following, or however, maybe they did have some rules back then, but.
I'm just going to read part of a paragraph here. Joseph found great favor and blessing in God's eyes, but his prosperous state lasted only a short time. He began this chapter as a slave, was promoted to chief steward over a high official's household, and was now a prisoner. In both cases, his confinement was not his fault. First, his brother sold him a slave, and then he was falsely accused. So where was God in all this? We just read that God was blessing Joseph and those around him. How could this be God's plan? And so, when things do not go as you plan, how do you respond? That is so crucial. How we respond, that God is doing something in the background that we don't fully understand. When things go wrong, when things break down, when family rejection comes, when a friend of ours rejects us, or anything, is it our fault? It could be. But in Joseph's case, it was not. It wasn't what he did or did not do. It was what God was doing and writing this in his life. Was it Potiphar's wife's fault? Was it Potiphar's fault? As you look at all that, it wasn't. God was writing a story. When you look at Job, God was writing a story. And so we find here that God was showing him mercy, was giving him grace to go on and to trust him. And we find that Joseph was faithful in doing what God wanted him to do throughout all of his life. I touched a little bit on the captain of the guard, and talks about that he bought him. He was the captain of the guard. In chapter 40, in verse 4, it says, "And the captain of the guard charged Joseph with them, and he served them, and they continued a season in ward." And so we find here that it gives us this same word, that this is probably more than likely Potiphar that's bringing these people into the prison, and gives that responsibility to Joseph. He's watched Joseph again be faithful. And so we find that is there. Just for a reminder, this Potiphar is a high-ranking official. He's trusted by the Pharaoh, and we find that was there. And Joseph sees these two guys and sees that they're troubled. And so that gives us a sense of being able to see in the life of a person when they're troubled. In the life of a person when there's issues going on in their heart. These men had a dream, they're troubled in their heart, they're sad, they're not sure what to do, because Egypt at that time would have had diviners and would have had the opportunity to see and recognize and to try and find out the meaning of the dream. And so this brings us back to, I want to go back to Romans 8:28 to 30, where it talks about that God is doing something. God blesses us. God directs us for all purposes, for His honor and glory. And so to grow us up into Christ, the image of His Son, He talks about that. And this is what God was doing with Joseph, that he would be able to be that. Talks about God's faithfulness in prison, where God blessed him and prepared him. Again, he talks about the how long a time that he was in. It says that the butler and the baker were in prison for a season. What was a season? Was it a growing season? Was it a year? It doesn't say. It was a period of time that he was there, that he watched him and got to know him. We got to visit with him and talk with him. I just can only imagine Joseph, as he walked around and cared for these people, he talked with them and heard their story and asked them questions to get to know them and how to care for them. And apparently he told the butler his story also. So I wonder how often Joseph told his story. I don't get the sense that he would have told everyone his story. But I don't know. But the important thing that I get out of this is if you have a story in your life, how God has brought healing, how God has released you from guilt, how God has released you from sin. If you have a story, don't be afraid to share it. Be encouraged to share the disappointments, the failures of your life, and how God has used them to bring honor and glory to you. And we find that I believe as he shared the story, I believe he shared about what he was doing and how he got wronged. And here he's still serving. He's still faithful to that call. Well, we want to move on into the fleeing temptation. I think you have it in your book. I don't have my student book here, but a couple of things here is that Joseph talked about God's plan for marriage. A a man and a woman be committed there, and it would be a sin. Again, how did Joseph know it was sin? There was no law. His father had multiple wives. His grandfather has no record that Isaac ever had more than one wife. Abraham had more than one wife. And here he's coming to the fact that he shouldn't have, a woman shouldn't have more than one. And so it's interesting. I appreciated that fact that, the law was not there yet. It would have been sin. Whether, if Joseph would have laid with her, no one else would have known, it still would have been sin. And that's the whole fact of sin. It's sin whether anyone sees it, whether anyone experiences the sin in our life or not. It's still sin in the eyes of God. And Joseph shows us that.
In verse 8 and 9, she says, no one's going to know. And then Joseph says, I can't sin against God.
Mm-hmm.
That different attributes on sin.
How was Joseph able to flee? In the midst of the feelings that he was going through as a young man. God has put within man the desire for sex as a blessing. He talks about that it is a blessing, and it is something that's very important. But fleeing and escaping about it. Proverbs 5:1-6 talks about a warning to anyone that gets into sexual immorality. The path leads to death. It's never enough to satisfy. One act will never satisfy. Marriage is part of God's plan. Outside of God's plan, it is sin. There in Hebrews 13:4. In 2 Timothy 2:22 talks about fleeing these youthful lusts and pursuing righteousness. And so how does Joseph do that? It's none other than his relationship with his father. And for us today to flee temptation, whatever it is, especially in our context this morning, the sexual, to flee the temptation that is there. It's always before us, and we have to have a mindset that we flee. And so as I look at this, Potiphar's wife was burning in that. And the society that we live in today is there's even a greater context than that, where women are becoming more and more aggressive and following that. And so in 1 Corinthians 7:9, it talks about, a husband and wife separating themselves. But he says, don't do it very long, because you could be defrauding, and that is sin. And I want to give this caution for us as husbands and you as wives, as you set a time to be apart. What is the purpose? Can you refrain from giving your partner the pleasure through the sexual act that can cause the other to lust and burn towards the opposite sex? The longer you withhold, the more you defraud, the greater chance that your mate can go into temptation within their mind, the lust and the desire to fulfill your body. And we need to be able to understand that. There is a time to restraint, but we need to be very careful that we don't set up the opposite, our mate, for failure, for temptation, whether they go into it or whether it's in their mind. Jesus says it's in your mind. If you think on a woman, or if you think on a husband and long to be with that person, that's sin. That's temptation and yielding. We are to be satisfied with the wife of our youth that talks to us in Proverbs and everything. And so we find that we need to be very careful that we don't allow that. We encourage sons and daughters to not follow the passions of the body, to flee as it says, those opportunities. Will your sons, will your grandsons know why they should run when a woman presents herself to them, or a daughter when a man presents himself to her? Have you done well at teaching your sons and daughters to flee, to run, to cry out to God, to seek Him, because God is the one that stands in the gap for those that are hurting or those that are wanting to hurt?
You asked how Joseph could do this. As you look at Joseph's life, he's one of the greatest examples or patterns of Christ. And like you said, he had a relationship with him. And when you check Joseph's life, you don't find a whole lot of stuff that he did wrong. I mean, he was still a sinner.
Yeah.
We can't deny that Christ wasn't. But by type of Christ, you can't find any better than Joseph. Like with this right here, Christ was tempted like we are. And Joseph was tempted and he fled from it. He could easily did it, but his relationship with God too great.
So, do you have a story of fleeing in your life? I want you to think about that. Do you have a story of fleeing in your life that you could tell your children and grandchildren, that they would be willing to flee also? And what was it that caused you to flee, to run to God, which is the one that sustains us and protects us and guides us and keeps us? How do you respond when you are treated unjustly? There's just so much more that we could go on into this morning and talking about that. You know, what do you do when you're treated unjustly? Not just once or twice, but continually, over and over again, by the same person, by different people, just numerous things. So, to avoid sin in our life, we've got to, we need to go and ask for forgiveness when we do fail, when we recognize that we have violated. Number one, who have we violated against? Joseph ultimately knew that he would have been violating God and God's command. And that is something we have to understand. When we fail, when we sin, when we violate, number one, it's against God. And then it can be against the other person. If we have failed a person, we need to go and ask for forgiveness. We need to be able to walk through. When a person comes to us, we need to grant forgiveness. And we see that in the life of Joseph again and again. You know, I wonder what he said to the butler after he got back into, when he got lifted up. Did he look at the butler and say, you're going to pay, buddy, because you did not remember. 2 years I stayed in prison. That'll come out maybe next week or the following week. I'm not sure which week it is, but think about that. It doesn't give us any reference. And I appreciated your thought, Ray. You know, there's no record. There's probably a time or two when people looked at Joseph and said, boy, you're not who you say you are. And there are times in our lives where people look at us and say, you're not who you say you are. And we got to recognize that and run from it. God bless you.